This is your urgent call to action. We are all called to lead in a world in chaos, crisis, and turmoil. Join a pivotal global movement for change to transform the leadership crisis worldwide. Will you play it safe, or will you wake up, step up, and speak out? Like Nelson Mandela did for South Africa and the world, we need a radical new way to think, act, and lead, leading boldly into the future. Join host Ann Pratt, a Harvard Fellow and multi-awarded businesswoman, and unlock the best version of yourself to revolutionize leadership with what the world needs now.
Greetings to all you future bold leaders. Thank you for joining us from around the world. My name is Ann Pratt. I'm formerly from South Africa, and I relocated abroad to attend a Harvard Leadership Fellowship in beautiful Boston in the United States of America. Our bold leader today joins us from the city of Cambridge in the great state of Massachusetts, across the Charles River from Boston. He is currently the president in residence and visiting professor at Harvard Graduate School of Education. Previously, he spent 17 years as a college president of Macalester College in the Great Lakes state of Minnesota, in the up Midwestern region part of the United States of America. He's a graduate and a scholar in Victorian literature. He has published 2 books and numerous articles on higher education in the Chronicle of Higher Education, in the New York Times, the Washington Post, and the LA Times. He is also currently the senior advisor to the president of the African Leadership University and serves on multiple boards, including the Haas Center for Public Health at Stanford University. We warmly welcome the humble, the smart, the compassionate President in Residence and Professor Brian Rosenberg, and welcome to Leading Boldly into the Future. So, Brian, thank you so much for joining this conversation. I've been looking forward to it, and I think that, you know, your own career from student to teacher to administrator gives a very interesting perspective in terms of higher education and its role in developing leaders for the world today. Thank you for being on.
My pleasure.
Great. I thought an interesting place to begin. I know you grew up, you were born and raised in the Northeast, and then you had a 17-year wonderful career as president of Macalester College in the Midwest in Twin Cities. What took you into the administrative role heading up a liberal arts college? What motivated that move for you?
Like a lot of people, my path was not always planned out. So when I was a graduate student in English at Columbia University, I was an undergraduate at Cornell University. So I was educated at large research universities. But when you have a PhD in English, you take whatever jobs you can get. You can't afford to be choosy. And so the first job that I got out of graduate school, tenure track job, was at Allegheny College, which is a small liberal arts college in Pennsylvania. When I took the job, I literally didn't even know where it was. And I thought I would be there for a little while and move on. And it turned out that I loved it. It really suited me in so many ways. I loved the variety of the teaching. I loved the freedom to do research in various areas. I loved the close contact between students and faculty. So I was there for 15 years. And while I was a faculty member, I became increasingly interested in the way the whole college worked. So I became a real fan of the liberal arts college. And I also, unlike a lot of faculty members, really became interested in things like admissions and finance and student affairs. I was served on a lot of committees. And after about 15 years, I had the opportunity to become a dean of the faculty at another liberal arts college, this time in the Midwest, Lawrence University. I didn't think I would do it, and I ended up running out of reasons not to. And so when I was at Lawrence, I learned even more about administration and how these institutions worked, and got to begin to learn how to be a leader. It was not something that I think naturally came to me. I had to learn it. Yeah. And then after 5 years at Lawrence, the McAllister opportunity came up. It really drew me for a few reasons. First of all, it's a first-rate liberal arts college. Second of all, it is located in an urban area, which is not the case for most liberal arts colleges. And I, having grown up in New York City, I like cities. And the mission of the college is very aligned with my own mission. The mission of the college is around internationalism, diversity, service, and that resonated with me. So it was the perfect spot. I got the job, and at the end of the day, I think that my particular skill set was reasonably well aligned with what's required of a college president. But if you had asked me a few years earlier, I never would have imagined that that's where I would have ended up. But I was very fortunate to be able to follow that path.
That's fantastic. And I am curious, what are the parallels, if anything, between Victorian literature, which is your one of your passions and forte, and being a leader of a liberal arts college?
So I think people at McAllister probably became tired of me quoting from 19th century literature. Dickens was the particular focus of my research. I quote from him all the time, and my favorite poet is John Keats, one of the great romantic poets. I quote from him all the time. But what I learned from Dickens in particular was that, a few things. First of all, you can't get caught up in bureaucratic machinery, because when that happens, it tends to rob you of your humanity. And that is a theme in many of Dickens' novels, which have a lot more social criticism, I think, than many people realize. And so I always tried to keep a human face and not let myself become subsumed by my administrative role. And the other thing that I always kept in mind was something that Dickens wrote about in Hard Times, which is not one of my favorite novels, but this is one of my favorite points. Yeah. He makes a distinction between knowledge of the head and knowledge of the heart. That is, there are certain things that come to you if you're smart, and then there are certain things that come to you if you're empathetic. And in my view, the best leaders try to balance those two things. And so I would draw upon the reading that I did, the novels that I read very often, sometimes publicly, sometimes just in my own mind, to remind myself what leadership is. And in a lot of ways, it means not losing your humanity, and retaining a lot of the qualities that it's very easy to lose when you are in a leadership position. So, I found the background in literature extremely helpful. It helped me with my communication skills. Obviously, it's useful as a college president to be able to write and to speak in public. And so I think my background in literature was very helpful there.
That's so interesting.
When you are trained as an academic, you come through school, you go into the classroom as a teacher, you are trained to demonstrate that you are the smartest person in the room. I think what a good leader does is make other people feel like they're the smartest people in the room. And so for me, those qualities of honesty, of sort of, I won't say self-effacement, but not making it about your own ego. Those things are really, really important in a leader.
Yeah. And from McAllister, you went on to Harvard to become president in residence at the Harvard Graduate School of Education. You're also a visiting professor, so you teach a couple of classes. And within your role as president in residence, I'm aware that part of that role is helping grad school, education grad school students think about leadership, think about the challenges in higher ed today. As we both know, Harvard is an Ivy League school. It's ranked as, it receives top rankings and has done for a number of decades. What, in your mind, Brian, are some of the big challenges, strategic challenges that face higher ed today, not only in the USA, but internationally?
Well, I'm glad you mentioned that Harvard was not typical. And I think it's very easy for those who spend their careers in a very rarefied world in higher education to forget what most of higher education is like.
Yeah.
And unlike a very, very small group of highly selective institutions, the vast majority of colleges and universities in the United States, and I suspect around the world, face some pretty daunting challenges right now. I think underlying it all, certainly in the United States, is an unsustainable financial model. For decades now, the cost of higher education has been rising much more rapidly than the ability of people to pay for it. So when you have a model where the costs are growing more rapidly than the ability of people to pay them, that is almost the definition of unsustainable.
Yeah.
And so I think figuring out a way to deliver a high quality education at a more affordable price is probably challenge number one for higher education. Higher education continues to be extraordinarily unevenly distributed. So there is a group of students that has access in the United States to the best education in the world. But there's a very, very large group of students, many of them from underserved communities, many of them first generation, who either never get to think about college at all, or if they do, end up in two-year community colleges where the completion rate is very low, or in public institutions where the completion rate is very low. And so those students don't get either the personal or the economic benefits of higher education. And then the third thing I'll mention is just the fact that higher education really, in my view, has not adapted its pedagogy to the current moment. The pedagogy that is used in higher education has not changed in dramatic ways, not for decades or even for hundreds of years, but arguably for more than 1,000 years.
Wow.
When universities were formed in Europe as early as 1050 and through the Middle Ages, the model was essentially the same model as the one we have now. In order to learn, students had to go to a physical place with buildings and a library with those rare things called books, and a group of experts who would fill them with knowledge. And despite all of the changes in technology and all of the changes in how students access information, I can get more information now on my cell phone than students could get from the Harvard Library 50 years ago. Despite all of that, higher education still continues to operate more or less in the same way. And we know from a lot of research that way is not the way that students learn best. Students learn best when the learning is much more active and experiential than when they're simply sitting and listening. So higher education it changes at a glacial pace, and it's slowly beginning to adapt to some of these things. But I think for the most part, the methods in higher education, for all the good they do, could be so much better if the sector were more open to innovation.
Yeah, I mean, that's such a good point. And I know you wrote an article called "Is Harvard Complacent?" and, some of the issues around these very successful, top-end, highly branded, high reputation institutions. If you were the president of Harvard, the next president of Harvard, what 3 things would you consider doing in effecting that kind of transformation that is needed to meet this moment?
So let me begin by saying that I don't pretend to have the secret recipe. I was a college president for 17 years. I like to think I was reasonably good at it, but I did not succeed, in my own view, in really bringing about transformational change in the way that Macalester College operated. Honestly, at institutions like Harvard, it is about as hard as it gets to do that. So I don't want to suggest that I could easily do things that previous presidents have not done. I think at this institution in particular, certainly one thing I would try to change, and I think is probably changeable with the right energy on the part of leadership, would be to make it less siloed. Harvard is an incredibly siloed place.
Yeah.
The phrase that people around here like to use is every tub on its own bottom. And people say it with a kind of pride, but I don't think it's a good thing. So one of the things I noticed was that students who were enrolled in the education school could also take classes in the business school or in the Kennedy School. And the rules in each school were different. Even the rules and how they dealt with the pandemic were different. The procedures for enrolling in classes were different. And it made students' lives enormously more difficult than they needed to be.
Coming back to the purpose of higher ed, and if we think about leadership in the world today in this current moment, I know you've also written quite a lot about things like the fragility of truth, some of the issues we're facing as a broader society. And of course, if we think about the mission of higher education, you alluded to Macalester, and of course we know part of Harvard's mission is not only to develop citizens, but citizen leaders in the world. What, in your opinion, Brian, is the current call to action in terms of higher educational institutions and the role they play in shaping and molding the leaders of tomorrow, future leaders?
On one level, I think the mission has been pretty consistent since the founding of the United States. And on another level, I think the mission has become particularly important right now. So the first two public universities in the United States were created by Benjamin Franklin and Thomas Jefferson. But the school that went on to become the University of Pennsylvania and the University of Virginia. Both Franklin and Jefferson were very explicit about the fact that democracies could not possibly survive without educated citizens. That in order for citizens to essentially manage the responsibilities of democracy, they needed to be educated. So yes, education prepares you for work, for vocation, but it's also a prerequisite for democracy.
Yeah.
And I think what we're seeing right now, in my view, is about as serious a threat to democracy in the United States as we've seen. I think colleges in this environment have a particular responsibility, not just to prepare students for jobs, but to prepare them to be engaged citizens and engaged in collective life. And part of that is teaching them the right history so that they understand the country that they're living in. Part of that is teaching them the right skill sets and mindsets. Part of it, honestly, is universities and colleges modeling the kind of behavior that they want to see in their students. And I don't think higher education has been very good at that. Higher education is in general a very cautious industry. There are a lot of different constituencies to please, and there are a lot of different viewpoints within those constituencies. And so by and large, colleges and college presidents have been very, very quiet, even as a lot of things have happened that pose very fundamental challenges to their work. And I don't think that has served the sector well.
What struck me about some of your classes you're teaching at the Grad School of Education, one I think on ethics and the other on transformational models. Is there a particular point in the class on ethics in higher ed that really for you is a critical issue around ethics in higher ed today? And can you share what that is and perhaps an example of where you have seen that enacted in higher ed institutions?
There are a lot. So we take up in that class really virtually all of the challenging subjects that are vexing higher education right now. And just as an aside, I wish those people who thought that higher education could not engage in spirited debate with all points of view could sit in on my classes and see how terrifically these students with a variety of points of view engaged in civil debate. And there are very few places in our society right now where those sorts of things take place. I think the couple that come to mind for me are, first of all, our discussion about whether higher education is a right or a privilege, which goes right to the heart of how it is funded in a society. Do we see the opportunity? I mean, in the United States, at least, the assumption is that a K through 12 education is a right. Everyone has legally an opportunity to obtain it. Yeah. Whereas we treat higher education as a privilege. If you can afford it, or if you can get sufficient financial aid, you can go. But if you can't, you're out of luck. And the question is, and it's a practical and also an ethical one, is higher education the same kind of privilege in our society as a K through 12 education? And why not? A lot of these ethical questions, I don't pretend that there's an easy answer, but it's a fundamental question, I think, that is sort of one of our political dividing lines. And even within, say, the Democratic Party, it's a dividing line.
So in these debates and the kinds of conversations, can you share with us some of the thinking around where current students believe, the line ought to be? What has
my students are graduate students, so they're a little older. And many of them have already had experience working in higher education. And I would say my students tended to lean toward the side of more openness to uncomfortable speakers, not speakers who really posed a threat or were deeply, deeply hurtful to members of the community. But to speakers whose views just made some students uncomfortable, I think the majority of my students, at least, were open. If you talk about today's undergraduates, I think they're a little different. Yeah. I think that we do have something of a problem right now, at least at some colleges, because students really don't want to be made uncomfortable at all. There, I think you're beginning to undermine what the purpose of a college or university is. Being made uncomfortable is part of being educated. Being threatened is not. Being hurt is not. But discomfort, hearing ideas that you don't agree with, hearing ideas even that you might find deeply objectionable. In my view, that's not enough to keep somebody off campus. It should not be.
What for you is the line?
I wish I could tell you that it was a bright line that never moved. For me, it is, most of these questions are careful balancing acts and depend very much on particular circumstances. The question I always asked myself was, am I providing every student on campus with an equal opportunity to learn and to thrive? And if some action or policy or speaker were really creating an unequal playing field for students, then it would give me pause and I would ask myself, is that worth it? An openly homophobic speaker who wanted to come to campus talk about the fact that LGBTQ students shouldn't be allowed at the college, it's not something I would have permitted, because it would have, I think, created an environment in which it would have been very difficult for those students to learn.
Yeah, I think that's fair. I mean, if we think about the role of academic institutions and the research component to provide substantive evidence and research-based examples to support an opinion or a view, I mean, I think that's a pretty fair criterion to establish.
People make the mistake of thinking that what goes on at a university is free speech. Again, at some public universities in the United States, they are subject to laws that require a certain amount of free speech. But universities curate and make selective judgments about speech every day in every class. Students will be told by a faculty member, no, that is wrong. If we do that every day, if we curate speech every day, if we make qualitative decisions about speech every day, that should apply not just to the students on our campuses, but to the speakers we invite as well.
Yeah, that's fair. What has been a defining moment for you, a just transformational moment? Is there a particular event that comes to mind that really helped shape who you are today?
I did not have, a James Joyce type of epiphany where suddenly the direction of my life became crystal clear. I will say that when I arrived at college at Cornell, my intention was to major in biology and be a pre-medical student and go on and be a physician.
Yeah.
And the freshman seminar I enrolled in was a comparative European literature class. And the very first book on the syllabus was a translation of Dante's Inferno, which I had never read, never thought about. And I started reading it and I couldn't stop. I remember as a brand new college student lying on a couch in the student union and starting to read this thing, and I read it all the way through to the end, and it got dark around me. And I was just absolutely captivated by this hundreds of years old Italian epic poem. I think there was no turning back from that. By the end of that course, I knew I wanted to major in English and be a professor.
In your transformational models, I know you've quoted ALU, as it's called, as an example of how to upend and transform education. Could you share with us, firstly, what is the focus of what you teach in terms of transformational models at Harvard Grad School of Education, number one? But secondly, can you take us to African Leadership University, and what is it about that new model of higher ed education that you believe truly rises to the call for action in higher ed today?
I tried in that class not to focus on models that were like, say, Minerva, which gets a lot of attention, but which, really is a very, very hard to scale. It's an extraordinarily expensive model. Minerva makes a big deal of the fact that they're more selective than Harvard. To be totally honest, I have very little interest in that. The last thing we need is another small, highly selective university, even if its pedagogy is different. So I'm most interested in models that are disruptive, but also replicable and scalable. Yeah. And so we do spend a fair amount of time on ALU, which I'll get to, but I'm fascinated by a little school called Sterling College in Vermont, which is one of the smallest colleges in the country. But what's interesting about it, well, a couple of things. First of all, unlike most colleges, it knows what it wants to be and it knows what it's not. So it is a college built entirely around commitment to the environment. That's what they do. I know pretty well the president of Sarah Lawrence College, and I think she is genuinely trying to shift the focus of Sarah Lawrence from being a very, very traditional, affluent New York liberal arts college to one that has stronger connections to community colleges, one that has more pre-professional programs in certain areas, that does more continuing education for people, because that's what colleges are going to need to do. as the demographics in the United States do not favor traditional higher education.
Yeah.
So we spent time on Sarah Lawrence, but ALU to me is the most interesting and exciting attempt at transformation that I know of. And so we devoted 2 of our classes. We brought a lot of people from ALU in virtually to talk to the students. And as I may have mentioned to you before, it is for me, the most interesting thing I've ever worked on in my career, and potentially the most impactful.
Can you share a few statistics around ALU, Brian?
So let me begin with some statistics about Africa, because you can't understand ALU without understanding the needs of that continent. Africa has the youngest population in the world. The average age in Africa is 19. The average age in a place like Germany, I think, is 47. So it is an extraordinarily young continent. And it is the place in the world that is least served by higher education. Something like 8 or 9% of high school graduates on the continent of Africa go on to college or university. And a lot of that has to do with the absence of available spots. There just aren't nearly enough colleges and universities to serve the students. And within a couple of decades, Africa will have the largest workforce in the world, larger than China, larger than India. So this is an area that is young, that is underserved by higher education, and that the world really needs to get economically more self-sufficient because it is such a big part of the world. In that context, ALU has been created. ALU is created in a context of constraint. In Africa, most students, even students who are part of a relatively small middle class, can't afford to pay more than, maybe $2,000 a year for a college or university, which is a tiny fraction of what most US colleges would cost. These colleges don't have the money to build elaborate campuses. There is a shortage of professors with PhDs. So, in that situation of constraint, where basically what you have to do is provide an education that is high quality, but much less expensive and much less dependent upon campuses and professors.
Yeah, that's really exciting, Brian. The other thing that struck me about the work that you and Fred Sonica are doing at African Leadership University is the kind of shift in terms of defining the goals of this higher ed model. And perhaps you could share a little more with us around that. What are the ultimate goals? What are the measurements of success and efficacy?
2 things that I'll talk about. One is the mission of ALU, which is to educate what we describe as ethical and entrepreneurial leaders for Africa. It has the word leadership in its name. It is Fred's belief, and this belief goes back to work he did as an undergraduate, that what's necessary for Africa to take the next step in its evolution is strong leadership. That is the component that's been missing. ALU's goal, one of its goals, is to educate that next generation of leaders who will, again, be ethical and entrepreneurial. So they'll do the right thing, but they'll also create things, create businesses, create opportunities for other people. If they go into government, create more equitable structures. The other goal, honestly, is to enable people to get jobs. You cannot overstate how important it is in that context to enable people to find economic security. It's not something you can take for granted. So, the goal of the overall African leadership group, of which ALU is a part, is to create 3 million jobs in Africa over the next 10 or 15 years. That has the potential to have such an enormous impact on the economic development of the continent and the quality of lives that people lead. So One of the things that we're most proud of at ALU is that since our first graduating class, students have gotten jobs very quickly and much more rapidly than the graduates of most universities in Africa. Some of them have also created businesses that have provided jobs for others. So I think we can never forget about that economic component of what we're doing.
Yeah, I think that's relevant. And what strikes me about the model is not only, one of the other statistics around Africa is the very high unemployment rates compared to, yes, varying employment rates in different countries. And, as we know, Africa is made up of 54 countries, but much higher unemployment on average versus other parts of the world. And also the mix of employment. It's not only corporate employment, it's developing entrepreneurs who then become the creators of employment for other people, so very specific to the continent as well. And I think very empowering in terms of developing entrepreneurs to, rather than seeking employment, creating.
Right. And that's why entrepreneurship is so central to the educational model. Creating things is, as you know, very difficult. And most startups fail. And that's okay. We want to give students practice at failing. And first of all, that builds resilience.
Yeah.
But, it is through making mistakes that you learn how to not make mistakes.
Yeah.
And so by giving students the opportunity as students to try to create things, even if more often than not, they're not successful, they will have learned a lot.
Yeah.
And so at some point they will create things that don't fail, that do succeed. And, one or two people can have an impact on thousands if they create the right things, as we have seen.
Yeah, absolutely. And, shifting to somebody that's, of course, an African son of the soil, Nelson Mandela, who I know also impacted Fred in his life. But I was curious to hear from your perspective, to what extent has Mandela been somebody who has shaped or influenced or inspired your view of leadership in the world? And is there a particular moment that comes to mind for you?
I obviously never had the privilege of meeting him or knowing him, but what always impressed me about him, he accomplished so much, but it was the absence of, he was never driven by anger. He was always driven by hope. He always seemed to believe that it was possible to draw out the best in people. It goes back to that issue of knowledge of the heart again. The closest I ever came to seeing that, I did have the opportunity to get to know Kofi Annan quite well. Kofi Annan graduated from Macalester in 1961.
I didn't know that. Really?
Yeah. So I got to know him, and there are a handful of people that you meet in your life who have almost an aura about them, and he was one of those people. And again, same thing. He always had hope. Given what he observed in his life, he'd have every reason to just despair about humanity, but he didn't. And in particular, he had a lot of hope in what he always called the young people and their ability to make the world a better place. And to me, that was powerfully influential and inspirational.
And you're alluding to Mandela and Kofi Annan, or
both of them? Yeah, but I had, again, the fact that I had an opportunity to get to know Kofi and to spend time with him meant he really, it was one of the great privileges of my life, and he really had an impact.
In terms of Mandela's leadership, life and leadership example, do you think that has relevance today? And if so, why?
Yes. I think it's rare. The ability to go through awful things and to emerge from that not driven by a quest for vengeance, but a belief that the best way to heal is through honesty, forgiveness. So much of our public life right now, virtually all of it appears, is driven by anger and by an inability to listen to and connect with people with whom you don't agree. He embodied the opposite of that. So those people, as I said, are rare, but I keep waiting for someone like that to come along in the United States who can begin to heal some of the rifts that are, frankly, tearing this country apart.
And to what extent do you think those kinds of leadership competencies could or should be integrated into leadership development? To what extent do you think they could or would be integrated with the African Leadership University?
I think you can try. There are no guarantees, and it's a lot harder to teach habits of mind and character than it is to just teach information. But one of the things that ALU does that I really am fascinated by is begin by having every student study what they call the leadership core. So every student does exactly the same thing for the first term.
Yeah.
And the leadership core focuses on, the hard skills that you'd expect, like speaking, writing, quantitative thinking. But it also focuses on things like empathy and self-discipline, working in teams, creativity, resilience. So, we do at least attempt to be purposeful in talking to students about and teaching students about some of the necessary personal qualities of someone who's going to be a leader. It's not simply about being smart. It's also about the kind of person you are. So, as far as I know, there are very, very few universities that try to teach empathy. I think universities too often just assume that students will absorb it through some automatic process, but that doesn't always happen. Yeah. And even if you teach it, it doesn't always happen, but at least you can make an effort.
Personally, I think there is a great opportunity, and I know you've been fairly outspoken about curriculum redesign, and from what you've done with Fred Sonica at ALU, you've certainly made great headway in terms of redesigning that. Just on a lighter note, a couple of fun facts.
I got to know Fred as an alumnus of Macalester, but not when he was a student, though I have heard many stories about him as a student.
Okay, so here's the first thing. What is one of the stories you've heard that really struck you about him and thought, this is a guy I need to get to know a little better?
So I went back not too long ago. Fred had a birthday, and I went back, and all of the old editions of the college newspaper are digitized and archived online. So I went back and searched for Swaniker. Yeah. And there was a long piece about Fred that was done when he was a senior. Two things struck me. One, which is that you could tell even then that he was someone with grand ambitions. But the other thing that struck me is that he was a very social guy. So apparently his room with his roommate was kind of a party hub for students. So he liked to have a good time as an undergraduate. He also complained, interestingly, that Americans worked too much, which is ironic given the fact that now he is about the hardest working person I've ever met. Fred defines the workday as 24 hours. So there's something ironic about him saying as a student that people in the United States work too much. He pretty much now outworks anyone I know.
That's interesting. And, you spent a number of years in the Midwest, in the Twin Cities, Minneapolis and St. Paul. What is it about, you mentioned you're a city guy, can you share something about the Twin Cities that really are part of your happy memories of being in the Midwest?
First of all, it is a beautiful place. The Minnesota is known as the land of 1,000 lakes, and there are just beautiful lakes in the Twin Cities that are great for walking or bike riding and all kinds of other activities. The Mississippi flows right through the middle of the metro area. It's what divides Minneapolis and St. Paul, and it's magnificent. And there are other rivers there, the St. Croix. So it's just a place of real natural beauty. It has its problems as an urban area, particularly around areas of questions of segregation and racial equity, I think. But by and large, it's a pretty kind place. I think people talk about Minnesota nice. Sometimes living in places like New York or Boston can feel like there's a kind of hard edge to everything, and that's not the way you feel in the Twin Cities. Things move a little bit more slowly, and people. I remember when I came back to New York after living in Minnesota for quite a while, I would walk down the street and look at people and smile. And they would look at me like I was a crazy person. Because if you walk down the street in New York, no one makes eye contact. Whereas if you walk down the street in Minnesota, people look at you and say hello. And that's okay. That's kind of nice.
Yeah, it is nice. It is Minnesota nice. And the third thing I was kind of curious to know, Brian, I mean, as college president, you went from this professor in Victorian literature to dean to president. What is one moment that was most difficult for you as president of Macalester that few people know about? What do you think was really a tough call for you?
It's not even close. The hardest moments were when we lost a student. And that happened, unfortunately, more often than I would have liked. There is in higher education right now a huge mental health crisis. And so during my time at Macalester, we had students who took their own lives. We had students who overdosed on drugs. We had even had a couple of students who were killed in car accidents. And there's nothing more difficult. Particularly at a community like that, which is relatively small, very close knit. When you lose a student, first of all, as a president, at least I did, I just felt personally responsible for every student on that campus.
Yeah.
But dealing with the grief, dealing with the family, dealing with the struggles of other students, everything else you deal with becomes trivialized in comparison to those moments. People would ask me, what keeps you up at night? And the single biggest worry you have every day is you come into work and there are these 2,000 students and you feel like you're responsible for every single one of them.
Yeah.
Their families you're a residential college, their families give those students to you and they expect you to take care of them.
Yeah.
And it's a really hard thing to do. And when you fail at it, it's really easy to take that personally. So those moments there are very few moments, honestly, where I'm completely lost for words. Yeah. But when I had, from time to time, to speak at a memorial service for one of those students, I always felt that words were just completely inadequate. So those are the hardest moments by far.
And to that point, Brian, I mean, having gone through those incredibly traumatized moments and really coming from somebody with your training to say that you were at a loss for words is quite a remarkable statement. What advice would you give to university and college presidents today who deal with that kind of trauma, or newly appointed presidents?
The most important thing you can be is present. When you're a college or university president, you're surrounded by lots of people who are very skilled at their jobs. And it's very easy in those moments to recede into the background and let other people take over, be the face of the college. But at moments like that, people expect to see the president.
Yeah.
And so whether it's talking to the family or showing up and speaking, no matter how hard it is at the memorial service, you have to be there. And so again, there's not a lot you can do to take away the pain. Sometimes when this would happen, the families would not blame the college at all. In fact, they would say, their child was happiest at Macalester.
Yeah.
There were other times when the family, completely understandably, was very angry at the college. That is not the time to get into an argument. That is a time just to take with patience and grace whatever criticism people want to give to you.
In terms of the words, as somebody who's so adept at the English language, are there any words that did kind of fill the space?
The most honest thing that I could say in those situations was that words were inadequate. Just acknowledge the inadequacy of the words. It would depend very much on how well I knew the student. If it were a student that I knew at least casually, being able to talk about some particular personal connection would be important and nice. If that connection didn't exist, you can't make it up.
Of course.
You just have to acknowledge that you didn't know the student personally, but that you empathize with the pain of the friends and the family. But mostly what you have to break through that shell of the formulaic and reveal yourself in those moments.
Yeah.
And so, I would get up and simply say, I don't know what to say. There were times I confessed the fact that I was frightened, that, the inability to protect all those students I found very, very scary. You have to show vulnerability. You have to be genuine. And so that's what I tried to be. I'm in addition to being a college president, I'm a parent, and it's impossible to see these things happen without thinking about your own children.
Of course.
And what it would be like for you. So I just think being authentic in those moments, being a human being, that's the best you can do.
Yeah, and really talks to part of the importance in terms of developing those capabilities as a leader. And I just thought in our sort of few final moments together, are there any final thoughts you have about the future of leadership and what you believe is required for this next generation?
Well, I've got to do a better job than my generation did, because I don't think that my generation has done a particularly good job. It's going to take a lot of resilience because we are handing to the next generation a boatload of challenges that can be really, really daunting. So courage, strength, honesty, none of these things is surprising, but they're really going to be necessary. And the ability somehow to bring people together and not chase them apart is going to be really, really important. Being charismatic can be, I think, exaggerated, but I think we need some people who are truly inspirational. You look around now and there aren't very many. You don't want to put all of your hope on this, but you do hope some of those people come along because it feels like we haven't had very many of those people for quite a while.
I'm truly grateful, Brian, for you to come share your innermost thoughts and coming along with an open mind and an open heart. And, it was actually Mandela who said, a good head and a good heart are a formidable combination. And I think, the work you're doing, not only at Harvard Grad School of Education, but also with African Leadership University, I truly look forward to how this story unfolds, how this model unfolds, sharing more of the results and the beneficiaries of this new thinking, this new work in the world. And I really look forward to picking up the conversation again. But thank you so much for being the kind, compassionate, smart human being that you are.
You're very kind. And again, it's been my pleasure.
Talking to Brian Rosenberg today makes us rethink about how do we bring higher ed into the 21st century to design and develop and deliver an education that is updated and tailored to meet the demands of what the world needs now. It's pretty remarkable that in this radically changing world, teaching methods and pedagogies have remained relatively static and stuck in the Middle Ages for more than 1,000 years. For those of us who have had the privilege of attending a higher ed institution, a college or a university, we know that most of the learning and teaching takes place in a classroom, in a physical space. It is bricks and mortar. It happens through books and libraries and case studies with a teaching and academic expert. And yet, ironically, while there is a very important place for this traditional academic rigor, the academic research reveals that there is a better way. About 10% of teaching and learning happens in a classroom. About 20% happens through our peers and mentors and coaches. And a staggering 70% of learning happens at the University of Life. It is learning by doing. It is experiential learning. It happens in the real world. It's a bit like talking and walking. It's innate. We learn as we go along. We learn by falling and getting up and building resilience too. And yet, why wouldn't we update and reform our current curricula to combine these three different combinations of learning in the classroom, of learning from our peers, and learning at the University of Life, learning by doing? It's also interesting for me to note that most societies in the world have regarded basic child education as a fundamental human right. We believe it's important we teach our kids to learn how to read and write and do arithmetic too. And yet we regard higher education as a privilege for the few. Why? What was the basis for these decisions? Why wouldn't we rethink in investing in higher education as a fundamental human right to help us build and serve our economies, to build the wealth of nations, and to build a resource, a capacity, a new set of skills that are demanded in this highly, rapidly changing digital world we live in today? It's time to rethink. It's time to reimagine what we would do in higher education to build and serve a world that is radically changing in this new digital age. So until next time, remember that leading boldly is about making thoughtful, clear choices. It is about bigger and better thinking. And bold leadership is about taking bold action, just one small step at a time. One small step for you, but together, a giant step for humanity. So come back soon, share with your friends, and join this global leadership movement for change, because the world needs you to lead boldly too. Take care and take thoughtful, bold action.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Leading Boldly into the Future. Please find links and connections mentioned in this show in our blog, and never miss an episode by subscribing at anne-pratt.com. That's ANNE-PRATT.com. May these insights from inspiring industry leaders, remarkable disruptors, and courageous champions of change bring forth a brand new you, emboldened, empowered, and ready to inspire hope. Come back soon, share with your friends, sign up on ann-pratt.com and join our movement for change. Why? Because the world needs you to lead boldly too.